Welcome to a special edition of the Darden Admissions Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Twitty, and you are listening to a new episode. On this episode of the podcast, I'd like to share a recent installment from our ongoing Faculty Spotlight series, the series we call Office Hours, featuring Alex Cowan. Alex is the member of the Data Analytics and Decision Sciences faculty. We recently took time to talk with him about his background, what brought him to Darden, the courses he teaches at Darden, his thoughts on product management in the technology industry, and so much more. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. And as always, if this conversation is helpful for you, please like this episode and subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an update. And remember, you can always check the episode description for links to Darden blogs, social channels, and more. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Alex Cowan. Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you. You're calling in from the West Coast. How is everything where you are?
It's great. We're having our seasonal rains, which is a big deal here, especially in the countryside of the SF Bay area, and it's nice.
All right. Well, just for our attendees, to give you a little bit of an overview of the conversation today. So, as always, these sessions are a way for you to learn a little bit more about the faculty, hear about the courses that they're teaching, their professional backgrounds, what they're interested in, and maybe some of the research. We tend to spend the first 15 minutes or so just kind of getting to know the faculty member, hearing their story, what led them to Darden. And then we tend to transition to talk about the classes that they teach in kind of the next third of the conversation. And then the final third tends to be kind of hot topics or things that they're researching or interested in that are going on in their particular area of expertise. If you do have questions as we go through today's session, please feel free to ask them via the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on them. I've got a whole list of questions that I've prepared, but always welcome your questions. So share them in the Q&A and we will answer them as we can. There's always typically more questions than we can get to, but we'll do our best. So Alex, let's start with the same first question we ask all of our guests here on Office Hours. Who are you? Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, I came to Darden as a practitioner. So I started my first tech company when I was 19, and I sold my last one the day that I started at Darden. There's I had a team in there running it. That was in 2015, and so I've been at Darden sometimes in a part-time capacity, but now full-time last 6 years since 2015.
Did you always know you were going to pursue an entrepreneurial path? I mean, 19, starting your first business, that's early for many entrepreneurs.
Yeah, geez, I'm not sure that I did, but in retrospect, I think it was more likely than it wasn't, because I always had a desire to go and try things out. And when I saw an opportunity, I just wanted to kind of drop everything and go give it a shot, which for me, at least in retrospect, is what kind of gets you over the edge to go do that sort of thing. So I don't mean to over endorse entrepreneurship as a career path. Can be a tough way to make a living sometimes, but I did enjoy it. And I still do. I still invest in some technology ventures and work with them. A couple of them founded by Darden alums.
Can you tell us about your first business? What that was about? What it focused on?
Yeah, well, gosh, it's a little almost probably anachronistic to the people on the call, but that was in Santa Barbara, California, and basically we were fixing computers, which sounds, I mean, most computers are more or less kind of throwaway at this point, but we started out just going to offices and fixing their computers, which were expensive and broke a lot, and their networks and their any kind of, like, back then they had relatively primitive network-based applications that they might use if they were a little on the bigger side to share files and things like that. So I was like a vacuum cleaner salesman. I would, like, go door to door and just be like, "Hey, does anybody need their computer fixed?" And that's how we got started. In retrospect, it was a pretty primitive way to do it, and it generated a lot of unnecessary waste, because we could have. I mean, not that we needed a super elaborate business plan, but we definitely could have been more surgical. But I think on the one hand, if it wasn't for the blithe ignorance of the first-time founder, we wouldn't have any startups. And on the other hand, that's what I like about being at Darden, is how, I can take what we've learned as a community practice, not just myself, and package that into experiences for the students that I think really do make a pretty big difference in terms of their ability to go after a venture effectively and run a good process, and one way or another have it be rewarding, either a terrific learning experience or a venture that works out or somehow leads to their next thing.
You mentioned you still work with some startups. What do you enjoy about working with startups, staying connected to that ecosystem?
Well, I I I the main thing, I guess, is that I love the work. I mean, I everything's an experiment. So week to week, you're always looking at a somewhat new situation, and I think that if you want to advise a startup and you see your job as having an early stage startup, and you see your job as helping them stick to some kind of plan, then it's just going to be a disaster for everybody. But if you're excited to try things and see what happens in kind of little batches, then that's pretty rewarding. That's the part I enjoy about it. And rightly or wrongly, I hate to be on boards for these early stage companies, because that's sort of porridge is too cold. I mean, we're looking at things in retrospect, lagging things quarterly, which is too slow and too, like, the interventions aren't tight enough for an early stage startup. And then I don't want to run another startup because I'm old now, and I have been doing it for the last 30 years. So meaning most of these startups I work with, I meet with them weekly. So I'm not running the place, but I'm not sitting back in my chair as a board member once a quarter either.
In our prep, you mentioned you're kind of in this role of investor advisor. What does that work look like? You have a material interest in their success, but also you have all this experience.
Well, it's a gosh, it's this is the interesting thing. I don't want to oversell entrepreneurship as a career path, but the one good thing about it, from the perspective of learning about general management, which is what we do at Darden, which is, do you think that's a term that's probably familiar to everybody already, or worth explaining?
Yeah, worth explaining. Share a little
I
bit more about
think
what we mean by general management.
I didn't really know what I thought it meant. Like, I don't like the rental car that I got. I want to speak to the general manager. What it means, I didn't know either until I started at Darden, is that you're training somebody to be a fiduciary of earnings, basically, which sounds boring, but to me that's like basically what I was always doing. And it means that you're in a job where you have some proxies for revenue and some proxies for costs, and your job is to strike the right balance to drive earnings. And just that you're what it really means, I guess, is that you have a coherent economic definition of success that you're working with, rather than, for example, you're just in sales, or you're just in accounting, or you're just in finance, or you're just in engineering. And so I think that for learning about general management, being an entrepreneur is great, because you, out of necessity, you work on everything. The buck always stops with you. And so that part of it is very, I think, pretty useful for everybody, because as students of business, people that are early in their careers, it's certainly not the only way to do it, but you learn a lot about everything. I mean, when I was running my companies in the early stages, at least, I was the head of sales, I was the head of engineering, I was the head of all the G&A stuff, and even the parts that I hated, like the G&A stuff. I mean, you have to learn about it, you have to deal with it. And I think that's a good, I mean, that's sort of what it is to be a general manager. You don't have to love every single discipline, but you do have to substantially understand it, and be able to thoughtfully engage about it with your collaborators. And I mean, I think that is, um, I mean, if I was going to invest in a company, that's, everything else being equal, that's the kind of general manager I would be looking for.
And so you're an investor advisor, and you mentioned, like, you don't want to be on a board. Porridge is too cold. You want to be actually close to the work. So how do you work with these startups? Can you tell us a little bit about maybe a startup you're working with currently?
Yes, yes. One of the ones I spend a lot of time with is Jedburgh, which is language learning, for professional language learning for the Department of Defense. So a lot of the UXs we do are a little bit like Duolingo, which I think probably more of the people might know, but there's instructors involved, there's specific programs involved, they're all in one branch or another military, so there's mission specific things that they're training for. So it has this aspect of also being enterprise software, and ultimately the proposition is pretty different. I mean, that 95% of the people that take up Duolingo will never get to any real fluency, which is okay. That's just how that business works. Um, the expectation is pretty different in these settings. It's like 70%, 80% of the people should get to fluency, and it's going to affect what job they get in the military after they leave. And so, what do I do there? Well, it varies a lot week to week. Some week it's internal stuff about who's doing what talent do we need on the team. Most weeks it's about managing the account and managing product development to deliver for the account and figuring out how to make that work. Um, and all of that stuff we treat as experiments. For example, where a lot of our UX are kind of gamified, as they often are in the like business to consumer apps. And so, we even something simple, seemingly simple, like adding a leaderboard, we have to dial, we have to take a perspective on that and say, okay, why are we doing this? Well, what we're saying is if we add a leaderboard, something good's going to happen. What is that thing? It's going to increase engagement. Okay, so how do we measure that? And so that's a lot of, I mean, in terms of what I teach at Darden and what my area of focus is, that's an example of the kind of thing that we do. I mean, you really have to carry your passion about the user and the success of the product into every little thing that you're doing, because should there be a leaderboard? Well, it's easy to be like, well, games have leaderboards, so sure it should, but maybe it shouldn't, because you never know. And two, there's 100, 1,000 different ways to make that leaderboard. Some of them be much better than others, and introduce it to the user and introduce it to the instructors. And so, on the one hand, it's just like any other job. You come in and there's a lot of work and it has to do with the details and so forth. On the other hand, it does have this, you have a lot of freedom about how you approach it. You also have, you have pretty high odds that your first iteration is not going to be very good. And that's one of the, I think that's one of the most jarring things about learning about not just entrepreneurship, but digital product development in general for the students is we in product design, we design for failure. I mean, 19 out of 20 experiments at Google fail. And they're not better than the prevailing alternative. So they introduce like a change to something, find that it doesn't help with whatever they were hoping it would help with user behavior, and they kill it and they try the next thing. And so that's one thing that that's a very different thing than making tennis balls or commercial real estate or opening up restaurant franchises. And that has a lot of kind of implications that ripple out into everything you do. And so that's one part. I mean, a lot of what we do is like that, and that's one part of it that maybe wouldn't be the same as what the folks looking at Darden are doing when they get up on Monday morning, but maybe for some of them it is.
So how did you get to Darden, Alex?
Well, I did a book with Wiley in 2012, and they said go out, and I was running my last company at that point, and they said go out and do talks, because that's how you go and sell the book. And so I did that, but then it was fine, I did the talk, we sold some books, but I kept wondering, is anybody actually doing all this stuff, or are they just saying, hey, Alex, that was a nice talk, I really liked it. And I just wasn't really satisfied with that. And so I started doing workshops, and some of those were at the iLab, which is a venture incubation program that we have at Darden, and that some students will spend their summer doing, for example. And so that's how I met the Darden folks, originally the Batten Institute for Entrepreneurship. And then we decided that maybe there should be a class about building digital products for the students. And over the years, we've just kind of ramped up into a portfolio of classes and a portfolio of classes online that have been pretty popular on Coursera.
Um, Tell us a little bit more about that book that you published. What was it about?
Oh gosh, it was called Starting a Tech Business, and it was essentially about what I had learned and my take at the time about what was important for somebody with a more traditional business background to learn about and to understand and to kind of consider if they were going to start such a venture. And that kind of evolved into the work that I do now on hypothesis driven development, which is not the not the most appealing term, but it is the basically the idea that everything's an experiment, which is not, I mean, this is not an idea of my own making. It's just like a lot of things in business and business education, it's just sort of a repackaging of ideas that people already have to try to make them a little more practical for people. And so the idea is just that um, is that your best bet for most people going into a tech business, whether that's as an entrepreneur or as a consultant or as a building software inside a company that they're at, is to treat everything as an experiment and front load the difficult questions about how we know if this is working or not, and how do we oblige ourselves to minimize waste. And what that means is how do we decide if we should kill this thing and try something else, which is extremely difficult to do in most environments, but extremely common in the kind of high functioning environments that people see from a distance. Most people like Google, Booking.com, they run a lot of experiments and they kill a lot of ideas, and that's okay. They're still wildly profitable and they do great. And there's more and more as more companies organize themselves around innovation investments, that becomes more and more prevalent. So there is, I mean, it's something where there's a change catalyst behind it that it is becoming more prevalent. And so that's essentially, in the book, there's a book now, Hypothesis Driven Development. There's the Coursera courses, and they're all essentially focused on that and how it works for learning what sort of jobs to do, problems to solve, topics to even test, how you go in and develop those ideas with a maximum of testability so that you learn early whether they're going to work out or not, and you understand why they did or they didn't, and it helps you make better decisions about what to do next. And then even how that extends to managing teams. And the other kind of, I guess, complement to that is I do a lot of work in the book, the hypothesis driven development book, about digital literacy. And so the students in the classes I teach, they learn how to code and develop their own products, and they pretty reliably do that every year. And as you can imagine, it's not very hard to do that anymore with the AI tools that are available, but it's as hard as it ever was to do it well and to make those products successful and be able to transition from experiment to experiment with intention, and where you minimize waste so that eventually you can get to a win.
Let's talk about your Coursera courses. Can you tell us a little bit more about those courses that you have out there?
Yeah, yeah, they're kind of two main course sets that Coursera calls specializations. One of them is called just digital product management, and that's a course primarily about how do you identify ideas? What is it like to do this work of a product manager? Whether that's your actual job title, or maybe you're a founder, maybe you're a consultant, but how do you, if your job is primarily to deliver new digital UXs either to an enterprise or out to consumers, how do you do that? And that covers experimentation, running a team, the interfaces with development, and then and design. And then we also have a course set called Coding with AI for MBAs. And that is about what a lot of people, I guess, would call vibe coding now, where I mean, that's a funny term because it started out as kind of derisive, but now it is sort of a thing. And so really it's sort of about taking the steps that were really crucial about fixing your design intent and unpacking it into codable steps, choosing between all the different alternatives you have for how you might implement the item in question, and then debugging and testing, functionally speaking, the work so you can get it working. And that's essentially the job of coding. And so the idea is that, excuse me, the students, one, can bring their own ideas to life, but also two, just going through those steps and practicing that with their own projects makes them much, much better, more creatively confident general managers, but particularly if they're going into an innovation heavy environment.
Yeah, you've talked about this idea of general management and being an effective general manager. To you, what skills or traits are you looking for in somebody as a general manager that you think really would set them apart?
Well, I still think the most important traits are the ones I don't really have in substantially. You know, it's the ability to empathize with people and get along and sort of understand what's going on with your team and your staff. All those things are really so important. And I've worked with some very gifted general managers. I don't consider myself one of them. I do my best. I muddle along, and then. And then there is the domain expertise of whatever it is that you're doing, which really is the part that I participate in teaching. And so in digital and digital innovation, it's there what we want to build is really two things. Is one that experimentation mentality and how that kind of cascades down to managing the rest of your team, but then also that creative confidence about being able to, where applicable, get into the details and participate in the process. Because I mean, we've known this for a while, but it's becoming more and more obvious. I mean, Instagram was 11 people when it sold for $1 billion, and so the being a good general manager, being an economically relevant general manager, isn't about so much now about managing a giant army of people. It's about getting to a really good pertinent idea, testing it and executing really well with an interdisciplinary team and really amplifying them and making them effective. And so for that, I do think that the creative confidence around design, coding, digital numeracy. I mean, I teach. I'm in the DADS area, the sort of AI, machine learning, statistics department, and so those are some skills that we teach at Darden that are also important going into those jobs, because if you go into them and you see yourself as non-technical and you think like, well, I don't just do that, then you're kind of on the sidelines. And it doesn't mean that nobody cares if you're an expert at these things, but in practice, it's important to care about those topics. It's important to be able to engage on them and ask questions and act on the answers so that you can help the team do better work. That turns out to be pretty important. And I don't think anybody's found a good way to teach general managers how to do that other than experientially actually doing some of those things and getting a feel for what they're like.
What's it like to develop an asynchronous course? We're going to talk about your courses that you teach at Darden, which are very experiential in nature, but a Coursera course is asynchronous. So how do you think about developing a course like that?
Well, honestly, for me, it was easier because I came to Darden as a speaker, which is the opposite of what we want faculty doing at Darden, not the way that we operate. And we have student-centered learning. Your whole job is to prepare the students to essentially come in and teach themselves the class. With Coursera, it's not just recording an hour-long lecture, but because that doesn't work, and people can go to YouTube and get that. But it is organizing a series of kind of 5-minute videos that for a week, let's say, that add up to an hour, and then interleaving different parts, really a different take on the learning experience, like quizzes and prompts that help the students think about what they're doing, so that they're not just sitting there passively watching a video the whole time.
Mhm. Let's talk about your courses that you teach at Darden. So these are experiential courses. What do we mean by experiential course? So we already talked about what we mean by general management, but probably good to level set here with an
Yeah.
experiential course.
Well, I also teach case based. So a lot of our courses are case based, and we and I didn't have these types of courses when I was in college, but these are a good way to teach a topic. I mean, you're going to learn accounting, you're going to learn finance, you're going to learn managerial things, you're going to learn strategy, as well as more technical things like statistics and decision analysis. So rather than being like, hey, this is how hypothesis testing works in statistics, we bring in a vignette about the guy that invented it, and how the tea test of like, can you tell the fancy tea from the cheap tea or not? And if you guess successfully once, is that definitive? Or if not, how many times do you have to guess before you figure it out? And so that's kind of our baseline, is those case-based approaches. And and then by contrast, experiential is where we more have the students go through the process of doing something they would do in practice, like coding or like designing a product, so essentially they're project based, but they're not just go off and do a project. I think one of our, in fact, I think it's Mark Lipson says we should be at about 7x on the quality of the learning through an experiential course. Otherwise, it's the job. You can go do the job and learn. The jobs are experiential, but unfortunately, with jobs, you're experiencing the same exact thing a lot of the time over and over again, and you're not really learning very much. So experiential courses are a course where you're doing this active practice, but you're doing it with kind of structure and objectives and supervision, not just from your instructor, but from your peers, where you get a sense of what it is to actually do these things. And the project itself is more so the learning vehicle as opposed to the cases.
You mentioned you're part of the.
I mean, I'm sure you know about it too. What do you think about
Oh
that?
yeah,
That
no,
summary?
I that you did a great job summarizing it. I want to talk about some of these classes too, because I think people will be very interested in hearing about them. So you mentioned you're part of the data analytics and decision sciences class. I mean, sorry, the area faculty area. So these classes are kind of nested within that area. Tell us about your digital product design course.
Well, we there the students learn about the fundamentals of product design, where we ask, like, okay, what are we trying to help this user do? What affordances do we put in front of them that will most help them do that? But the most important thing is testability. And so there we spend a lot of time on, like, what's the connection to data analytics and decision sciences. The main connection is that we have to be able. Good design is testable. That's the difference between design and art. Design has some kind of commercial objective, and whereas art's just, hey, it's art. People like it, great. If they don't, then it's just is what it is. And so the one of the most important implications of that, I think at least, is given the fact that 19 out of 20 things in digital are going to fail, is that a good design then is a testable design, and you can test it in single subject usability testing, where you would say, hey, show me how you would do this with this app. Or you also want to have what we call OECs, overall evaluation criteria, so that as you release the app, excuse me, you're able to observe, and you have a threshold of, like, this has changed the user behavior in a way that's significant, and we should keep it, or we should get rid of it and try something new. And so we spend a lot of time on that. How do we go through and pair qualitative and quantitative evidence so that we can make nice, crisp decisions? And that may sound like, well, it may sound obvious, but a lot of companies don't do that. What they do is they spend a lot of time treating these things like a project. They do it in big batches. Like, you can't take a 9-month idea, slice it into 1 week, sprints or whatever, and treat it like an experiment. You just won't get, you're not affording the opportunity to change course. And so that's what we're encouraging, is how do we front load those hard questions? How do we front load the analytics that we're going to look at, rather than we do a big thing, we get a bunch of analytics, and then we puzzle over them and have a bunch of meetings to argue about what they mean. That's, in practice, it's pretty much, you can observe it as simply as that with a team. And believe me, I've seen both plenty. I continue to see both plenty. And it's just like a lot of things. The experimentation stuff works better. Very few people disagree that it's a good idea, but also very few people have the discipline and the training to actually do it on a consistent basis, outside of a few centers of practice like Facebook and Google and so forth.
It's interesting to hear you talk about that process. Is that, you have to shift out of kind of like a project management mentality to engage in the kind of work that you're describing? Is that kind of like a big mind shift and culture shift for these companies?
It is, yeah. And I do a lot of work with my colleague and department head Yael Grushka Cockane, who teaches project management actually. Um, and it's not like those considerations are irrelevant, but in project management, you have this. I mean, a lot of the basis of it is you have this triangle of cost, schedule, and then the quality of scope, scope or depth, or whatever the output is, and that is absolutely the right way to build a highway or a building or a factory to make tennis balls or something. But particularly even 10 years ago, but particularly now that you can push a button and have an AI code an application for you that'll do a certain thing pretty reliably. It's just not very pertinent. I mean, you can in digital to a large extent you can sort of build whatever you want, but the hard part is deciding what that thing is. And so yeah, it really does invert the it really does make the sort of traditional aspects of what's important about project management not as relevant. And and it and I think that that's new to most of our students because that explicitly or implicitly that project-based approach is how most business stuff is still conducted. And I don't it's not because people are silly or it's just the way that things have been done. I think that in a way project management is a little more intuitively relatable. Like if you're a kid and you're like, hey, let's build a sandbox, like it's tangible, it makes sense, you can observe whether the sandbox gets built or not. Whereas this idea of like we're running an experiment to see if we can get certain outcomes in human behavior, it's more appropriate, but it is a little less immediately intuitive to people. And I think that that's the value of having structured practice around it.
The courses that we're talking about here, just for our attendees, are kind of a part of a digital capstone. The next course is coding with GPT. People
Mhm.
have asked in the Q&A about AI and leveraging these tools, and does it make coding easier? But you mentioned, to do it well, you really still have to understand the code. So coding with GPT, what's this class all about?
Well, that's a class I'm teaching now, and it is I um I have to restrain myself a little bit because it's kind of my baby, and I could talk about it all day. But um, there's a very the jobs of coding and the jobs of computer science started to really substantially diverge about 15 or 20 years ago, and they continue to do that. And so you have kind of a very traditional approach to learning computer science, which is what you would get in college, and is a great way to learn about the fundamentals and a great way to sort of train yourself to be rigorous. And then you'll have these boot camp kind of approaches to learning computer science, which are almost like a general assembly or a lot of online courses. And those are almost the exact opposite in a lot of cases. It's very phenomenological, and the criticism of the traditional way is like it's a lot of stuff that isn't very relevant if your main thing is to build applications. I think the criticism of bootcamp approach is that it's too brittle. You take people off the yellow brick road that they've learned, and they have trouble, because they don't have enough on fundamentals. And so our this class has always been very product first, design first. Like, let's understand the product design and what we want to have happen, which any coder that's experienced will tell you is the hardest part of building a product. And let's work backwards from that. And so we're not like, hey, these are the three things you really need to know about building front ends or whatever. We just say, here's some tech notes. You can figure this out with these, and give it a try. Bring your questions to class and let's talk about those. And that has turned out to be, for the last 10 years or so, a great way to teach MBAs, at least, to be better product people. And it's awesome. I think it's really turned out to be right down the middle of what how you make use of these AI tools, because we were always like, if you take away that from this class that like, oh, where you put the semicolon is really important, then I think I couldn't think of a worse learning outcome than that. Because while that may matter, really what you need is to learn is like analytical debugging, how you figure out where the problem is in your code. And a lot of the time you're writing code that doesn't matter. Most code ends up in the trash. So how do you keep that program focused? And So this is a class where we embrace all these LLM based tools, all these AI based tools, and we use tools like Cursor and GitHub eventually, although we start off with simpler things like JS Fiddle, and we start from design briefs that are essentially what a student would do in the preceding class, the product design class, and they learn incrementally how to code from those, and we focus on really four fundamentals: how to express your design intent so you stay focused, how to unpack what you're doing into codable steps across data models, front ends, and also controllers, algorithms, that are going to tell the code what to do. How do you effectuate between alternatives, which sounds kind of abstract, but is actually a big part of modern development. What digital tools or piece parts are we going to select to build on top of? Because most software now, part of the reason why beyond AI, it's been so cheap and continually cheaper every year to build software is that there are more commercial and open source building blocks that we're building a contemporary application on top of. So picking those with a testable view towards why and how we know every stack decision becomes wrong eventually, about which thing you're picking. And so we spend time on that, and then we spend a lot of time on analytical debugging, because I think that that's a great way for a general purpose coder to figure out, like, am I good now? Do I know how to code? Is that they're able to analytically debug their way to the code outcome that they want, rather than like, well, I tried this and it didn't work, and I tried this and it didn't work, and then I tried this and it did work, so I'm not going to touch that, and that, I'm going to just call it done. That's that's where I would say, like, that student still has some work to do on getting creatively confident about making their code do what they want, rather than having their code tell them what to do.
In our previous conversation with Michael Albert, he talked about, now you're starting to get into the world of AI slop, where like there's a lot of like work that's done through AI, it's maybe not quite as good, as it could be. How do you think about, I guess analytical debugging comes in here. How do you think about leveraging these tools in a thoughtful way to get to a quality product?
Yeah, that's a good question. We spend a lot of time on that now in class, because the coding part is so fast and relatively easy. Because of the assistance of the LLMs. Every student has the greatest TA on earth, looking over their shoulder, available to answer any question, any time of day or night. Um, so I would say, on the one hand, if nobody uses the thing, it doesn't matter how it's built. It's irrelevant. It's going to be waste. On the other hand, that's not how most software that people end up working on, which is successful software, is maintained. There is an element of continuity. So we spend a lot of time in class on. So good means that two things in practice. One is that the user uses it, and that means that's true for an application that has a billion users, as well as an application that has 0 users. And it cascades. It's sort of existential and big picture with the new product, but a good product can become a bad product if it becomes encumbered by lots of features that aren't very relevant. And so that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is like, your second stakeholder that you're looking at is like the person that's going to work on that code day 2. So have you created the code in a way that's intuitive and easy to work with and amenable to change, because you have to kind of expect the unexpected with code. And so we do a lot of work also around that second thing. And for example, the very last class of coding with GPT, the teams have to pair with someone from outside their team and work with that person to make a change to the code and actually commit it to production, like bring it live. And that in fact is a major bellwether that engineering managers will use to see how healthy an individual team is. They hire a new dev. How long does it take that dev to become, not just necessarily make their first commit, but also to, become effective? Because that's a good bellwether for whether they have a lot of what we call technical debt and the codes become really complicated and hard to work with, or whether the code infrastructure and the pipeline that they use to iterate on it is healthy and amenable to change.
I want to talk about the next and sort of final course in this sequence, which is the digital capstone, and say,
Yeah.
how does that course fit into all of this?
Well, that's where we kind of practice like we play. And that course this is not very typical Darden, but it has prerequisites, and that students can do those through the Coursera courses if they, for instance, missed the course over the course of the school year. But those students have passed some kind of sufficiency for product design, coding, and analytics, data science, AI, inference. And so they're working on a project that came out of the Q2 class, but there's no fixed trajectory. I mean, every week they have to kind of practice like you would play in a real product team and say like, here's what we're focused on and why, how we'll know if it's working. Here's what we did last week and how it went, and then here are the things that we're grappling with. And the practice that they get that I think is really important in that class is how the skills, the disciplines of product, general sort of product management, but more specifically product design, coding, and analytics and inference kind of interact with each other on the ground. And that's the kind of talent that I could never hire enough of when I was running my own companies, and is still in short supply. Is I mean, that's sort of a renaissance general manager in tech today, or anything, sort of digitally innovative, is somebody that can walk into a situation and understand not just the core business of it, which is really important and the basis for everything, but also, do we have a design problem? If we do, what is it? Do we have a coding issue or a coding task that we've got to do? Do we have how are our analytics? Are we able to make the inferences? Are we making the most out of the data we're collecting? It's very hard to find talent that can walk into a situation and diagnose that and then act on it effectively with an interdisciplinary team. And that's what the students are practicing in the capstone.
Ask you about one more class, and then we're going to talk about sort of product management generally and kind of where you think it's heading. But you have a class also on digital product management, and so what does that class entail?
And that's more of one of these case-based classes, which is intended for a more general audience. And so we have cases that we bring in about product situations, but startups, big enterprises, gov tech, enterprise software, and we look at more foundationally what are the jobs of a general manager in these situations, and we'll call them product managers out of convenience. And so really we look at the three core jobs of product management, which are identifying promising hypotheses about product market fit, which is just like what might be a good idea. I mean, out of the 100 things we might do, which are the 5 that we should work on? And then how do you work those with an interdisciplinary team? And so, how do you create a testable definition of success that's resilient to a result that you get that's a failure, in terms of user behavior, because that will happen a lot, most of the time. And then how does that connect with all the things that you might need to do to manage outside stakeholders like legal or the upper management, or if you're doing this as like a contract place, your outside customer, your economic buyer. And so we have this in a way, it's a more traditional Darden class because we're primarily working with these cases to answer those questions, but we use those cases to get at the fundamentals of this idea of product market fit. Like, how do we go from 0 to 1 and find something scalable? How do we create focus in a situation where, like Dropbox, for example, and 8 years in, they're growing fast, but they're not growing in a vacuum. They have to make some really that they could focus on X and go astray, or they could focus on Y and do well. How do they both decide what to focus on, but also decide that with intentional testable criteria so they're ready to be wrong and minimize waste around that decision? And then we deal with kind of the somewhat longer tail of topics that come up, like analytics, cybersecurity, when working with big, huge stakeholders like the government, where change can't just go off and do whatever you want.
Interesting question here in the Q&A. Obviously, when you're working with MBA students and you're teaching electives, so these are second year MBA students or folks who are in the elective period of their program. What do you see as like the biggest adjustment for them when they're working in this product design? Like, what do people like struggle with initially, like mind shift wise? Like, what is the biggest adjustment that you see students struggle with?
Well, if I may, I'll kind of like slice the students into three broad segments because they'll sort of have different initial things that'll be hard for them. So the first segment is students that are like, "Hey, I've been an investment banker for 5 years. I don't know what any of this stuff is. I'm just playing along here, and I'm going to try it out." And that's actually probably the best way to engage with the material. Is without any like just like, "Hey, I'm going to give this a try. I don't have to go do this stuff in practice if I don't want to, but here I am. There's this class. I'm going to kind of trust the process and see what happens. I'm going to ask questions, but I'm going to take this as it comes." The second segment of students that I wouldn't say they struggle exactly, but I can see them kind of getting over this project-oriented mindset. There's a lot of students that have been involved in contract product development. And so in a way, the digital development process is really familiar to them, but their definition of success has actually been kind of a little truncated because it just has to do with like, we're Infosys or we're Deloitte or something, and we're building something because a client told us to do it, and they have to be happy with it. Really, is like how we make money. And so there's, actually, we were just talking about this in class. What's the difference between acceptance criteria and evaluation criteria? And acceptance criteria is kind of designed for a stakeholder say the thing's okay, which is, a necessity, but it's no guarantee that the product's actually going to be successful with its real user. So there's that second segment of students that's been in that bubble of contract development where they're not the actual end user or end operator of the software. And then the third bucket is, the students that I probably find most relatable, but they're the most difficult to teach, is the first time founder because they just want to get something out there and see what happens, which is perfectly understandable. And I've been that person multiple times. But they're going to be really focused on how do I just get something out the door to see what happens, regardless of what it is. And so they learn, and then there's versions of that, versions of students who have been in a startup before and seen that, like, yeah, you can't just run off and build something and hope that it works and find success most of the time. Sometimes you can, you get lucky, but usually you don't. So those are all students that do great in class, but they definitely have different things that they will contend with through the course of the classes.
So Alex, I want to ask you some questions now about product management and kind of where you think things are headed. So first question is, you're trying to prepare people for what's happening out there in the real world. Where do you see product management headed?
Well, without sounding overly expansive, I think it's just I think that the general job of product management, whatever the title is going to become is actually is a major growth job because it is effectively general management, which you can't automate away. I mean, you can't go to ChatGPT and be like, "Hey, make me some money," and have it, deposit money into your bank account. It just doesn't. That you still have to ask it the right things and connect the dots and execute. And so I think that the jobs that are in jeopardy are things like, you know, I don't want to have to be responsible for the overall outcome. I just want to do my thing. Like I just want to be in charge of accounting, or I'm just a mid-level developer. I make code. That's my job. My job is code. Those are the jobs that are at risk because the AIs are getting better and better at just going and executing those things. Even if they're not as good as people, they're really fast and they're very relatively inexpensive. And so I think that personally, I mean, probably every faculty comes to these things and, there's probably somebody who'll come and tell you that tax is the job of the future. And I don't, maybe they're right. But my particular perspective is that the person, the 20 something, 30 something that's going to the job market today, that's ready to take responsibility for an economic outcome and make it happen with a maximum of kind of perspective and a minimum of kind of like, well, there's this area of it that I just don't want to have to know about. That's the person that's going to be most effective, whether they're, a singleton entrepreneur initially or working in a big company. And so um, I think that's where product management fits in. I think it's kind of it's more and more going to become kind of the everything job of a lot of companies because it's just it's getting so easy to build software. It's getting so easy to get to a lot of data and quality inferences without having somebody sit down and grind through all the data and join the tables. All those There's a lot of technical jobs that are really in jeopardy because they were just this what we consider now sort of drudgery that an AI can do. So we're at this like kind of cotton gin moment, with like um, with white collar work where so many of the things that everybody used to think of as like a career path are going to be automated effectively by AIs that I really think that the things that we call product management now are going to become more and more the kind of durable skill set that white collar workers are looking to acquire to have longevity and happiness and have an interesting job as they go forward.
It seems like you're making a case for that sort of general management perspective
Yeah,
that we talked about
absolutely.
earlier.
Yeah, I think in tech, I think that there's no one that's more valuable than a creatively confident general manager. And traditionally, the view has been, well, no, it's engineers because they're the creative ones and they can build stuff, and that's been true, but that's becoming less and less true. But what I would also say is like the engineers that ended up being successful, you only hear about their successes. Usually they were the same person. They just happened to be trained in engineering and they kind of went and learned about how to sell stuff, or they somehow intrinsically knew about it. And they kept trying things until something worked out. And so I really I think it's always been a job with really great durability and relatively high odds of success over time if you're executing a good program. And so in that sense, I think like 10 years ago was the same thing with just sort of a glimpse into the future of where that work's heading. And I just, we're seeing a change catalyst that's just thrown that all into overdrive. That catalyst being AI, of course.
Yeah, that brings me to the next question, and I think you touched on it already, but I'm curious, do you have other thoughts? Like, how do you see AI changing the job of tech product managers? Is there anything else you'd want to share along those lines?
Well, I think that it sounds crazy to somebody who's probably working in a more traditional environment, but once you've done it, I don't think it does. I think it's very plausible that what we're going to have in the next, as we go forward, is product managers who effectively build their own stuff. Just because it's the through line from idea to releasable code is so compressed. And if you look at tools like Cursor and Replit, I mean, we're already pretty close to that. So you have an engineering team that kind of builds the sandboxes, all that stuff operates in because you have to make sure the code can run, you have to make sure it stays secure, but there are ways to automate that at a relatively high level of abstraction and give your end user, this product person, a lot of freedom of action. And so I think that's what product management may look like it already a little bit does, but I think it's going to increasingly look like that in 5 to 10 years. And I think it'll be great for the people that learn how to do it because for an energetic product manager, they just want to get something in front of the user and see what happens. And they don't want it, all the other stuff is a means to an end. So it's just going to get easier and easier for them to focus really on the core of what that job is. So
What do you
I'm pretty sanguine about it. I'm less sanguine if it's like, well, I just want to work on, this one little facet of it. That may be okay. There may be a job to kind of build the infrastructure around that, but the people that drive earnings I think, are gonna be these sort of product people.
what do you make of all the investment in AI right now? Obviously, there's so much in the news about is it a bubble? Is it not a bubble? Where's all this going? What's your read on all of this?
There's definitely aspects of it that are bubbly, and there's definitely parts of it that there's so many interfirm transactions where losses are getting kind of like scuttled away that I mean, if you looked at it on a historical basis and you were going to roll the dice, you'd say like, well, the odds that there's some kind of bubble in the sense of well, I mean, last night the market went down 2.5 points. So, I mean, there'll almost certainly be something that looks a bit like a bubble, like certain assets or certain companies kind of dropping in value a lot. Um, and I don't think that, but that's not going to change the course of what happens, and it rarely does. I mean, even during the dot-com bust that I lived through, you know, in 2000, if you were an e-commerce expert, it was like you were laughed at, and it was like, look, you bet on the wrong horse. And then 4 years later, nobody could hire enough of those people. When the commercial internet started to become more of a thing, that's what everybody wanted expertise in. And so I think we'll see some asset price adjustments, to you know put it mildly, but I don't think it'll make a difference. I think that's just people over investing in stuff that they didn't quite understand, and didn't set the value of correctly, which is a hard thing to do. Um, Especially with so few good investments that are sort of publicly available. So I think that we'll probably will have some of that, but it won't change anything.
I'm curious if you were a prospective MBA student on the call today and you're interested in tech product management, what would you want these folks to be thinking about? What would you be thinking about as you're like starting off on your MBA journey?
Oh, well, if they're like, let's say they're working now and they're coming to Darden this fall. It's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, I think that's what Darden is. They don't have to do anything. They can just come in, and they're going to go through a process that's going to prepare them really well for what's next. On the other hand, there's lots of material out there about. I mean, it's easy to read in the news like what's happening with all this AI stuff. You have to go and engage with material that's a little more disciplined to understand why it's happening, and bring in some ideas that could potentially help you create that change, or at least frame it in testable terms. Um, so I think they should all read my book, Hypothesis Driven Development. That's the best thing they could do for themselves. I mean, I'm kidding, but I think I don't if I thought about the things that were most disruptive for most of the students, I think that it's that, like we talked about in the beginning, that idea of what if everything's an experiment that we're doing here? We shouldn't take anything for granted that it's a good idea. Every idea is bad until it's proven to be good, rather than good until it's proven to be bad. And there's a lot of really great work on that. I think the hypothesis-driven development book is a one minor, planet in that orbit, but Stephen Tompkins' work on experimentation, he's at Harvard. His work is great. He has a book called Experimentation Works, which is more of an airport book. You can just buy it, read it on a plane. It's just examples. And um, there's a book that has a much worse title, but is great, called Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments. And that's a great book about the actual practice of a certain type of testing, but it's very representative of how we do product management. I think those are good books that are harbingers. What I don't, there's also a trend like, well, you need to really understand how LLMs work. Well, like, that's ironically, being in the department that I'm in, I think that's an interesting thing to look at. But even for data scientists, it's such a kind of rarefied area that I think it's good to have an idea notionally about how they work, but we are increasingly engaging with them on kind of a phenomenological basis. Like, we do this certain thing to them, how do they behave, rather than 5 or 10 years ago, we were like, oh yeah, well, we have to know what model we're using and tune the parameters and try a bunch of different. I mean, so much of that is just abstracted away, and you don't really need to worry about it for 95% of things. Just like you don't need to worry about the performance of your database for 95% of things. I mean, you need to worry about it, but somebody else is worrying about it for you. You're able to use a service that you pick the right thing, and they're going to handle that. You can focus on what you're doing. I so I
So
I don't mention that to be, I think it's always good to say, like, what is the thing that everybody's telling you should focus on that actually maybe isn't as important as you might think. So I think, like, learning about the process of experimentation in these product environments is really useful. I think that learning how AI works is, at a certain point, basic level is important, but beyond that, that's more of a career path than something that a general manager needs to be super fluent in.
Alex, I want to thank you for your time. This was a great conversation. I've learned a ton. I will admit, I came to this conversation without knowing much at all about tech product management. So I want to thank you for your insights, and thanks to all our attendees for your good questions and for being here today. We'll be back in December with another one of these conversations with Panina Feldman. So thank you again, Alex. Have a great weekend. And to everybody here, have a great weekend as well.
Thanks for having me.
And that was my conversation with Alex Cowan, a faculty member in the data analytics and decision sciences area here at the Darden School of Business. As always, if you have any comments, suggestions, requests, anything you'd like for us to cover here on the podcast, we're all ears. We can be reached at Darden, that's DARDEN, @virginia.edu. Till next time, stay safe, be well, and thanks for listening.